to this CLS Distinguished Professor lecture by Dr. Mary Murphy from the Department of History and Philosophy. The Letters and Science Distinguished Professor is an award that we bestow on our exceptional researchers and teachers in the college. And the holders of this award should have a sustained record of scholarship recognized nationally and internationally, a record of excellence in teaching and mentoring, outstanding contributions to their profession, the state of Montana, and to MSU. It's a 3-year appointment, and each distinguished professor gives a lecture during the academic year. It is the highest honor that the college bestows upon a faculty member in the college. And certainly our speaker tonight is very worthy of this honor. Dr. Murphy has taught at MSU since 1990. She has excelled both as a teacher and researcher. She's known for her work focusing on gender in Montana. She's published 10 books and book chapters, including Hope in Hard Times, Nudeo Photographs of Montana, 1936 to 1942, which won the Montana Book Award in 2003. Dr. Murphy's book, Mining Cultures, Men, Women, and Leisure in Butte, 1914 to 41, received the 1998 Barbara Sudler Award from the Colorado Historical Society and was a Choice Outstanding Academic Book in 1997. Dr. Murphy has served in the Humanities Montana and Montana Historical Society boards, and she was named a Humanities Hero by Humanities Montana in 2012. And last year she was honored with a Governor's Humanities Award. During her time at MSU, Dr. Murphy has won several awards for teaching and scholarship, including the Wiley Award for Meritorious Research, the Betty Coffey Award for contributions on behalf of women at MSU, and she was the Michael P. Malone Professor of History from 2005 to 2010. In her nomination packet for a distinguished professor, a colleague of Dr. Murphy's wrote, "Recognized as one of today's leading Western historians, Mary Murphy is an effective and beloved teacher and an outstanding social historian whose scholarship illuminates the lives of ordinary Montanans and the larger histories of the United States and of the North American West. Her scholarship, lectures, and public presence have, for over 3 decades, demonstrated the significance of daily acts for making history." And before Dr. Murphy takes the podium, I'll just remind you there is a reception after the lecture in the lay lounge. Professor Mary Murphy.
Well, thank you all for coming, and it is appropriate that we have a reception afterwards because I am going to talk a lot about food. I want to first just make a couple of comments of thanks, and that first is to Joni Sanford, who isn't here, but who made the great poster for my lecture and who did all the publicity and logistics, and she's such a treasure in the Dean's office. I also want to thank Dean Ray and my colleagues in the College of Letters and Science for giving me this award. It's very humbling to be named a distinguished professor in a college that has so many dazzling scholars and teachers. And I especially want to thank my colleagues in the Department of History, Philosophy, and Religious Studies. I believe that I have flourished because I have been surrounded by people with imagination and curiosity who have given equal attention to being excellent teachers and rigorous scholars. But even more so, they are people of good humor and great personal kindness, of which I have been the beneficiary many, many times. And finally, I want to thank my students, several generations of whom are here in the audience, because they have just made my job so darn much fun. So let's begin. On April 5th, 1917, Jeannette Rankin stood on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, voted against American entry into World War I, and famously said, "I want to stand by my country, but I cannot vote for war." Rankin, a representative of Missoula, Montana, was the first woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. And her victory came in part because Montana women had achieved women's suffrage, the right to vote, in 1914. Yes, 2014 is the centennial of two important events, one of which is the beginning of World War I, and the second is the winning of Montana women's suffrage. Rankin's vote against joining the Great War was, as people described it, her maiden vote. And it is hard to imagine a more emotionally and ideologically fraught issue for the first woman in Congress. To put it mildly, reactions were mixed. Many newspapers upheld her right to vote her conscience. Many, unsurprisingly, factored gender into their comments. The Bozeman Chronicle accused her of throwing a fit of female hysteria. Helena's Record Herald argued that when Rankin stated, "I want to stand by my country," she proved her patriotism, and when she continued, "I cannot vote for war," she proved her womanhood. When people vilified or praised Rankin's vote, they were tapping into Americans' conflicted passions about World War I. Europe had been embroiled in the war for nearly 3 years when Congress voted for the United States to join the fray. Even though the vast majority of American newspapers favored the Allied point of view, Americans had not been uncritical of the Allies' actions. The 56 congressional votes cast against U.S. entry into the war represented the deep divides that the American public harbored over the role that the United States should take in the world, the ethnic divisions of a country of immigrants whose sons faced each other across the desolation of no man's land, the suspicion that the blood of those sons would feed the profits of munitions makers. In this context, what were women supposed to do? Well, they did much as Jeannette Rankin did. After voting her conscience, Rankin then upheld the majority decision and worked to support the war effort. She gave public speeches to raise money for the Red Cross and Liberty campaigns, Liberty Loan campaigns. She entertained Montana soldiers when they came through Washington, D.C. She called attention to the poor conditions in military camps. And she responded to women's complaints about food. Indeed, Rankin's first speech in Congress was not about the cause that she had advocated for so many years, women's suffrage, but about food. In May 1917, she offered an amendment to the Lover Bill that in addition to instituting measures to increase food production and conservation, also provided for a survey of the food supply. Her amendment proposed that when practicable, women would be hired for the survey work. She argued that food conservation is a national problem and it is the natural outgrowth of women's fundamental work. During the course of the war, the meaning of women's work and women's understandings of the connections between domesticity and politics would undergo significant changes. Women would be called upon to turn their daily chores into weapons of war. But there were unintended consequences to that enlistment. Women asked to think about food in political ways, learned to think about power in many ways. The final version of the Lever Bill created the U.S. Food Administration. Herbert Hoover, famous for his work with the Commission for the Relief of Belgium, served as the unpaid administrator. From the war's beginning, food had been a critical issue. In Europe, sweeping campaigns and fixed battlefronts destroyed thousands of square miles of rich cropland. Farms became trench-ridden battlegrounds. Millions of men who had been farmers were now soldiers, and women had not been able to fully compensate for their lost labor. Blockades of maritime commerce ended or diminished vital transport, especially of grain, and German submarine warfare decimated shipments of meat and grain from the US, Canada, Argentina, India, and Australia. In several parts of the world, crop failures were rife in 1916, and by 1917, the world food supply was depleted. Thus, when the Food Administration adopted the motto, "Food will win the war," it was not simple propaganda. Hoover commanded a three-pronged food campaign, each front engaging women. The first sought to increase production, the second to preserve foodstuffs, and the third, to conserve food by reducing domestic consumption. There's seats over here. On a local level, the food administration depended upon voluntary county food administrators who reported to state supervisors. In Montana, the state supervisor was Alfred Atkinson, a professor of agronomy at Montana State College here in Bozeman. And this is Atkinson and some band playing in front of Linfield Hall, which is where his office was. And Atkinson would go on to become president of MSC in 1919. As the land-grant college and the home of the Extension Service, MSC was integral to the Food Time War program. Farmers and ranchers tackled Hoover's first charge to increase food production, government encouragement, seed loans, easy credit to purchase equipment, and a guaranteed price of $2.20 a bushel for wheat, which was more than double the pre-war price, resulted in record acreage cultivated during the war. In 1913, Montana farmers sowed 1.3 million acres of wheat. By 1918, that number had reached 3.5 million. By 1918, 3.5 million. And livestock production had skyrocketed as well. Atkinson viewed women as auxiliary to this task. Described by a colleague as a man who might be wrong but was never in doubt, in 1914, Atkinson delivered an address entitled "Agriculture for Women," in which he pronounced, if Mr. Jones was a farmer, Mrs. Jones was a necessary adjunct, not to farming, but to Mr. Jones. An Extension Service bulletin from June 1918 assessed the labor needs of the upcoming harvest and echoed a deep-seated belief that Euro-American women should not engage in agricultural labor. Expanded production and the fact that the armed services had taken up so many men caused the author, E.L. Currier, to speculate on just who would work the harvest. He suggested that if the usual transient harvest crews were not plentiful enough, help might be gained by the U.S. Boys Working Reserve. And this was a cadre of high school boys trained for agricultural labor. Or he said perhaps retired farmers who, with a little hardening up, could manage the physical demands of the fields. And Currier admitted that women had often been mentioned for farm work, and he reluctantly conceded, while most of us do not like the idea of asking women to do work of this character, women would be seen in the fields that summer more frequently than ever before. This prospect disturbed his sensibilities, and of all possible options, he favored the proposal that urban men performing jobs in cities that women could easily do should turn that work over to women and return to the farm. After all, he declared, public opinion should be such as to force every man in the state to do a man's job. But the government was encouraging everyone, men, women, and children, to grow food, and as Fred Cooley, head of Montana's Extension Service, noted, the whole country bent nobly to the task. Lawns, railroad rights-of-way, public commons, and vacant lots became alive with people tending gardens and potato patches. The volunteer-based National War Gardens Relief Commission plastered bulletin boards and windows in railway stations, libraries, stores, factories, banks, women and men's clubs, with posters proclaiming, as you can see here, every garden a munition plant and the seeds of victory ensure the fruits of peace. Charles Lathrop Pack, president of the commission, urged the patriots of America to turn vacant lots, or as he called them, slacker lands as useless as the human loafer, into community gardens. The U.S. Bureau of Education also launched a gardening effort. The United States School Garden Army enlisted boys and girls as gardening soldiers, much more common in urban areas in the East Coast and Midwest where children weren't working on farms already. The School Garden Army shared the same goal as the National War Garden Relief Commission, to grow food for local consumption, freeing up market crops to be sold to the Allies. Philander Claxton, U.S. Commissioner of Education, sent a letter to every school in the country asking the boys and girls of America, will you go out into the no man's land back of your house or in the empty lot at the corner and reclaim that territory for the United States? Your trenches are the garden furrows, your ammunition are garden seeds, your weapons are the spade and hoe. Children were organized into companies with a captain, lieutenants, and lots of privates, and the federal government sent them all bronze service bars. The members of the Industrial and Social Conditions Committee of the Montana Federation of Women's Clubs had a cautionary word. They did not object to the militarization of gardening, but they feared that patriotism would veer into child labor. The committee cautioned against pulling boys from school to work on farms. School gardens for small boys and girls are a wise use of child labor outside school hours, they wrote, or as a course in agriculture in the school curriculum. But the ordinary farm in New Montana is no place for young boys or girls. Club women urged the state to keep schools open and to enforce the compulsory education law. In 1918, the Montana Council of Defense put an imprimatur on the gardening movement, ordering all mayors of Montana towns and cities to encourage their residents to plant war gardens. In Plentywood, Mayor J.J. Gunther called upon his townspeople to spend less for gasoline, do less joyriding, plant more war gardens. In a nod perhaps to the strong contingent of communists and socialists in that red corner of the state, he added, call them Liberty Gardens if you must. The superintendent of buildings at the University of Montana in Missoula caught the war gardening fever and planted the university grounds in potatoes, harvesting 200 sacks in the fall of 1917. Yet despite Gardner's best efforts, by late 1917, drought and pests were already thwarting Montana farmers. Several months after Mayor Gunther called upon Plentywood citizens to plant war gardens, the local newspaper reported that sugar beet worms, also known as fall army worms, were devouring gardens across the county. While wheat acreage had nearly tripled since the beginning of the war, crop yields were declining. The average yield per acre in 1915 had been 18.4 bushels. In 1917, it was only 7.3. And by the time drought devastated the state in 1919, it had plummeted to 2.7 bushels per acre. Women reported heroic efforts, but failed gardens with little produce to preserve. Ida Kurth wrote from Freud to a home demonstration agent who had told her about a bulletin on canning. The bulletin you spoke of is saved for a better year. The bulletin that Kurth referenced was a publication of the U.S. Cooperative Extension Service, established in 1914 with little funding and few staff. In Montana, 2 female home demonstration agents had been expected to cover the entire state, but the war invigorated the service. Beginning in May 1917, a dozen or more new county agents were hired, and these were the home extension or home demonstration agents who in the summer of 1917 spread the gospel of canning throughout Montana, distributing 9,000 instructional bulletins in what Fred Cooley called an orgy of food preservation meetings and demonstrations. This was the second front in Hoover's food campaign, the preservation of foodstuffs. But Montana efforts were a drop in the bucket compared to the War Garden Commission, which used public libraries to disseminate millions of books and leaflets on gardening, canning, and dehydrating food. Indeed, the Commission's statistical claims were staggering. According to Charles Lathrop Pack, its campaign was so successful that in 1917, women canned 500,000 quarts of vegetables and fruits. In 1918, he estimated, they put up 1,450,000,000 quarts of vegetables. Bess Rowe, Montana's state leader of home demonstration agents, explained their task was to teach housewives how to comply with the requests of the Food Administration and at the same time maintain the health of the family through proper feeding. To make its work more efficient, the service helped organize women's patriotic councils made up of representatives from existing women's clubs. The Extension Service also formed flying squadrons of agents who organized 387 farmers' defense meetings in June and July of 1917. Each squadron included a female home economist who gave a canning demonstration and discussed the wartime food situation. And canning and drying became a national food crusade. Not only were women encouraged to preserve food in their own kitchens, but all the food preservation groups advocated community endeavors. In Montana, a drying and canning center opened in Helena. The Patriotic Council of Missoula initiated a canning center in a downtown department store building where volunteer teachers from the university gave canning demonstrations. Additionally, the space functioned as a day nursery where children were minded while their mothers engaged in Red Cross work. In Great Falls, where the school board and the Federation of Women's Clubs spearheaded a garden movement in 1918, Nevin Betts, the home demonstration agent, taught girls to can and had boys in the manual training classes learn how to make food dryers. During the 1918 canning season, Great Falls women also made 300 pounds of the somewhat controversial sauerkraut. Many Americans shunned sauerkraut during the war, despite its new wartime moniker as Liberty Cabbage. Indeed, the Food Administration issued a formal notice encouraging people not to, quote, let overzealous and ill-advised patriotism curtail your sauerkraut consumption. And in an effort to get Montanans to eat more of the healthy, briny cabbage, Alfred Atkinson assured them that it was probably of Dutch rather than German origin. The third aspect of the food campaign became highly politicized. During World War I, America did not impose food rationing. Compliance with Food Administration directives, the famous wheatless and meatless meals and then days, was all voluntary. But enormous amounts of propaganda and peer pressure often made compliance seem compulsory. One example of how this worked was here at MSC. The college issued a booklet urging women to organize into great armies of non-combatants by focusing on home economics in order to learn the best methods for contributing to the world's food and clothing supply. The Home Economics Department offered courses in peanut butter in war dishes and conservation as applied to clothing. The 1918 class president, a female home economics major from Bozeman, wrote her thesis on war breads. Paralleling classes for homemakers were courses in secretarial skills and accounting procedures designed to prepare for women for jobs once occupied by men now called to war. Dean of Women, Una Herrick, helped organize female students to support the war through the food program. Herrick encouraged female students to sign a sugar pledge that read, recognizing the present shortage of sugar available to our allies in the war, we, the women of Montana State College, are glad to join the Food Administration efforts to reduce sugar consumption in the United States. And to this end, pledge ourselves not to use more than 1 tablespoon of sugar a day and not to eat more than 6 pieces of candy a week. They even agreed that each piece of candy should be no more than 1 inch square and 1/2 inch thick, roughly the piece of 1 piece of fudge. And if some thought their efforts silly, the young women reminded their male counterparts that if you cut back on tobacco, beer, and liquor, it would save a lot of sugar, barley, and corn for the men at the front. Women's voluntary organizations carried the banner of conservation. The Montana Federation of Women's Clubs and the Red Cross were the 2 umbrella organizations organizing women's work. Established women's clubs embraced war work that was often funneled to the Red Cross, and new organizations formed with patriotic agendas. The Women's Patriotic League of Silver Bow County, founded in April 1917, coordinated the efforts of associations as diverse as the Lutheran Guild, the Welsh Aid Society, and the Pythian Sisters, who devoted hours to rolling bandages and knitting socks and sweaters. The Masonic Temple and Hennessy's department store donated space for Red Cross work, and by the armistice, the women of Silver Bow had manufactured more than 750,000 bandages and dressings, and a prodigious number of pajamas, shirts, pillows, sheets, and knitted articles. In rural areas, women just as diligently participated in Red Cross work. Elizabeth Pope Mclain, who homesteaded with her husband Roy and daughter Lizzie near Collins, kept a diary during the war. On May 9th, 1918, she and Lizzie were down with Liberty measles, the euphemism for German measles. But a week later, the Mclains attended a Red Cross dance in Collins, and between June and December, in between gardening, housework, and cooking for the threshing crew, Elizabeth went to 13 Red Cross meetings at various women's homes, hosting a meeting on October 9th, the day her husband hauled their wheat to Farmington. In clubs across America, women turned the educational segments of their meetings to wartime issues. They listened to programs on canning, war gardens, and the transportation of foodstuffs. They stopped serving what was called the fourth meal, refreshments, in order to conserve food. At the meeting of the State Federation of Women's Clubs in Great Falls in June 1919, women looked back on their efforts. For the convention's entertainment, 2 Montana State College faculty members wrote a 2-act play called The Hooverettes. In the first act, set in 1908, lavishly dressed women played cards in the lounge of an overly furnished, fussy clubhouse and nibbled on elaborate refreshments. In the second act, set in 1918, the same clubroom had been transformed into a food laboratory, and the same characters participated in a Red Cross meeting discussing food conservation. This time, they were all costumed in Hoover Aprons. And this is a Hoover apron. Hoover Aprons were just one of the many voluntary insignia that became part of marketing food conservation. Housewives signed pledge cards and then displayed them in their windows. They sewed official Food Administration conservation uniforms, which consisted of a cap, an apron, and insignia that quickly earned the sobriquet, the Hoover Apron. The Food Administration originally sold this pattern, but soon McCall's and Butterick pattern companies carried it as well. Hoover's name had become synonymous with conservation. The press labeled the apron-clad women Hoover's Army, and to Hooverize meant to conserve. The Food Administration used all the media of the day, including motion pictures, to get across their message. In 1917, a feature film, Little Miss Hoover, employed an actress wearing a Hoover apron demonstrating food conservation in a modern kitchen. Some of the lasting remnants of the Food Administration's propaganda campaign are the colorful posters that I've been showing you. They blanketed the country with slogans such as "Lick your plate and lick the Kaiser," and "Eat what you can and can what you can't." And they pushed using substitutes as a conservation measure. Cooks were enjoined to replace wheat flour with barley, rye, corn, and potato. In one of its more unusual measures, the Food Administration advocated the use of whale meat in soups, stews, curries, and roasts as an economical and excellent substitute for more traditional meats. Even without the challenges posed by acquiring whale meat in Montana, substitutions required new recipes that frequently bore erratic and often inedible results. Many loaves of war bread were fed to chickens. But this made women feel that they were indeed doing their part. And the pervasive propaganda of World War I frequently succeeded in convincing civilians that they were crucial to the historic effort of the war. It also led them to their own innovations. While the government and national women's magazines published cookbooks and pamphlets and bulletins with wartime recipes, local women's groups came up with their own creations. The Hot Springs, Montana Red Cross Society published a wartime cookbook, stating in its preface that its purpose was, quote, not for the recipes and money derived from the sale of the book only, but that the society wished it to serve as a memento of these stirring, history-making times, when we showed to the world and each other that we could be true, red-blooded Americans in every sense of the word. We can help this war by eating, they said. But of course one had to eat by conservation guidelines. Their book included all kinds of recipes using leftovers and included such dishes as Woodrow Wilson's OK hash, General Pershing salad, Hoover corn and Graham gems, and General Joffre pudding. Many of the recipes called for using Ravalli oats, a wheat substitute produced by a local mill in Missoula. Indeed, one of the challenges for cooks was to figure out how to make bread, rolls, pie crust cakes, and other baked goods with greatly reduced portions of wheat flour. In the cookbook, War-Winning Recipes, produced by the Young Ladies' Sodality of Missoula's St. Xavier Church, one recipe for conservation oatmeal cookies was wheatless, eggless, and sugarless, but required 3 cups of corn syrup. Hoover Aprons, colorful posters, experimental recipes, a billion canning jars full of produce were the constructive side of the food war. But there was a darker side as well. Not all merchants did abide by Food Administration directives. Volunteerism could veer into oppression when neighbors turned to spying and tattling on each other for perceived violations of the food rules. And Hoover's commitment to volunteerism meant he also rejected regulation to curb inflation, price gouging, and fraud. The Food Administration records are full of complaints about people, cafes, and bakeries that exploited wartime conditions. A traveler wrote to Herbert Hoover about a cafe in Lewistown, Montana, complaining, "Yesterday I was charged 25 cents for a cup of very weak coffee and 3 small donuts, the whole of which was the largest part of said donuts." But what really irritated him was when he discovered that locals were only charged 15 cents for the same bad coffee and runty donuts. Mrs. George Parker sent Atkinson a loaf of raisin bread that she had bought at Bozeman's Bon-Ton Bakery, and asking that he analyze it, for it was impossible to eat. She speculated it must contain either sand or ground glass or something foreign to bread. Atkinson replied that he had received several similar complaints and upon investigation discovered that the bakery had indeed undergone construction in the last 2 weeks and that plaster had gotten into their flour, not an approved substitute. But in other cases, businesses deliberately disobeyed food rules. For example, the Silverbow Candy Company used sugar it claimed it had purchased for canning to in fact make syrups and flavorings for ice cream. Charges of food hoarding or failing to use substitutes were common. Since the Food Administration rules were supposedly voluntary, there was a convoluted process to punish violators. The Food Administration staff in Bozeman investigated charges, and if they seemed credible, the accused was given a hearing and a decision was rendered. If the accused was found to have, quote, failed to properly observe the regulations, they were then, quote, allowed to make a specified donation to the Red Cross or sometimes forbidden from purchasing sugar or required to return flour. In January 1918, Atkinson had appealed to Montana women's clubs to form 3-person food rule enforcement commissions, which would discourage violation of rules by word, letter, or telephone, or if necessary, by public remonstrance. These food police, he called them, should be women of the highest patriotism, certainly no slackers. Slacker was a very favorite term during World War I. But he wanted no slackers. He wanted women who would pledge themselves to openly take issue with any man or woman whom they find disobeying food rules. Grace Vance Erickson president of District 1 of the Federation of Women's Clubs, and wife of John Erickson, who would become Montana's governor in 1925, advised Atkinson that he would be unlikely to find women willing to join such committees. Alternatively, she proposed sending capable, strong women out into the community in an educational campaign, which would, she said, do about the same work without creating the antagonism of the food police. County food administrators formed the front line of enforcement, and some were, in fact, fervent overseers. In Prairie County, Administrator De LeSueur instructed boarding house keeper Mrs. R.L. Castleman that she could not place a sugar bowl on the table or pass one to her boarders. If a boarder wanted sugar in his or her coffee or tea, Castleman could put 1 teaspoon in each cup, but only in the kitchen before it was served. Elmer Johnson, the administrator for Ravalli County, reviewed grocery store records to assess how much sugar people bought and sent them admonitory letters if he thought they had purchased more than they were entitled to. Perhaps the most zealous food administrator was Jerome Locke of Livingston. Locke was rabid in his opposition to socialists, wobblies, and anyone he judged pro-German. In the spring of 1918, a Mrs. Carlson came to his attention. He alleged that she was known to be violently disloyal, to have indulged in seditious utterances, and to have perjured herself in attempting to obtain a draft exemption for one of her sons. He claimed to have spent days in his car watching her, hoping to get sufficient evidence to prove that she was, on top of everything else, a food hoarder. Locke wanted to make her an example, arguing that if we can get one conviction, our troubles will be lessened. He told Atkinson that if he could not get a conviction on food hoarding in Park County, he would ask to be replaced as the food administrator so he could, quote, take a job as leader of the vigilante committee. And I must note he spelled vigilante incorrectly. But it was not just food administrators who were zealous. The Food Administration files are packed with letters from people who used food as an excuse for reviving long-standing grievances, for casting aspersions on neighbors of German background, as well as for expressing well-meaning concerns and fears. One letter from a woman in Wolf Point illustrates the many axes upon which women's concerns turned. In September 1918, a woman, I'll call her Mrs. Jones, wrote to Atkinson to complain about a neighbor, I'll call him Mr. Schmidt. She said Mr. Schmidt was letting his cattle destroy the corn crop of a young homesteader who was serving in the war. The young man's mother had planted the field for her son, but she was working in town, and despite chasing off the cattle many times, she could not protect the crop. In her absence, Mrs. Jones asserted, the neighbor, a low, degraded German, let his cattle break the homesteader's fence and eat and trample his crops. She also accused Schmidt of breaking into the boy's shack to steal a pair of pliers and accused his wife of stealing eggs from his hen house. Mrs. Jones noted that the cattle in question had been eating other neighbors' alfalfa and that Schmidt's hogs had been bothering her for 2 years. Moreover, she described Schmidt as prosperous. He owned his own farm, which had, as she said, all kinds of grain, cattle, and horses. Yet, he had purchased only $50 in war thrift stamps, while others with much less had signed up for $100. Jones hoped Schmidt would be drafted and put to war where he belongs. It's hard to know which of the many grievances that Mrs. Jones enumerated bothered her most. The Food Administration received scores of complaints from farmers that cattle were damaging their crops. This old grievance, based upon open range laws that required farmers to fence crops but did not require fences to enclose animals, was given new life during the war. Farmers wanted the Food Administration to prosecute livestock owners on the grounds that they were threatening wartime food production. the fact that Schmidt was prospering in a time when many homesteaders were struggling and being driven off the land, that he was allegedly thieving from a soldier, that he was cheap and unpatriotic and German, all rolled into quite an indictment. But the accusation that Jones saved for her final volley was that Schmidt was imposing upon this young homesteader's mother, who was not only deprived of her son, but now unable to protect his crop. Women, despite their best efforts to remain patriotic, grew increasingly frustrated with the economics of trying to support the war and take care of their families in the face of what they perceived as ill-conceived policies. George Bolster, food administrator in Sheridan County, sounded a bit desperate when he wrote to Atkinson that he was besieged by 300 old women who could not get the sugar they needed for canning because of the convoluted way in which sugar certificates were distributed. A month later, J.F. Files, administrator in Rosebud County, reported that thousands of gallons of wild plums were going to waste because the local store did not have enough sugar certificates. And Mrs. W.J. Pennington of Cutbank testified to the difficulties of abiding by the food rules. She documented her attempts to use substitutes, but noted that as soon as the government says eat fish, the price of fish skyrocketed. Butter substitutes cost just as much as butter. She was eager to do what she could for the war, but the miserable profiteering concerned her, and she hoped that all the crooked things would soon be straightened out for all. Butte women decided to attack the miserable profiteering through the Butte Housewives League. The league bypassed middlemen by arranging with farmers to ship carloads of produce to Butte and then sold the goods directly to consumers at the railroad freight house. Additionally, 2 delegates from every woman's club in the city comprised a women's council that investigated the food distribution system. They monitored wholesalers who apparently tried to dump edible food in attempts to decrease supply and drive up prices. And 2 other booster clubs, which had formed in Butte to combat high prices, complained to U.S. Senator Thomas Walsh about another crooked thing. They claimed that the county food administrator, grocery store owner William Luty, was in fact hamstringing their efforts by persuading wholesalers not to sell to citizen organizations. Many women proclaimed that they would not support food conservation until prohibition had been put into effect. Since, as one farm wife put it, as long as the breweries are allowed to buy up the grain and use it for poison, what little we save won't amount to much. Other women were angered by the government's continual prodding of housewives to save small portions, while it deals with gluttonous and traitorous speculators in a soft and piddling manner. Why should they be overworked, planting, growing, harvesting, canning, conserving, while Mr. Exploiter exists uncontrolled and reaps that which we have sown? It raised the hackles of Eva Little of Plains to read in the newspaper advice from an English lord on what Americans should eat and how they should economize. Then she continued, how can we call our allies democratic when they have kings, queens, lords, dukes, etc.? Have we not also got to be careful, or we will have a greater autocracy in this country? Are we not giving our president even more power than the Kaiser has? Producing, cooking, and serving food had always been traditional women's work. During the war, those domestic tasks took on added political significance. In order to gain women's cooperation, Herbert Hoover and others told women that was once considered necessary but insignificant work now had global consequences. It is not surprising that women bombarded with new messages about the political importance of their daily chores could expand that thinking to other political and social issues. As the comments I've related illustrate, women used their domestic tasks as a springboard to critique the economics of food distribution, the priorities of food conservation, and the very nature of American democracy. As Una Herrick said, women went into the war in a hobble skirt, but came out less hampered in mind and body. Indeed, Montana women, while willing to make sacrifices for the war, were not willing to make those sacrifices unconditionally. In 1917, the Montana Federation of Women's Clubs, which lent its considerable organizational skills to the war effort, outlined what women expected in return for their cooperation. The Federation argued that if mothers of the country freely gave their sons, that those boys be housed in morally clean camps, that if there really was a serious food shortage, the national prohibition should be enacted as a war measure to save grain, and that if the future of the nation and of world peace depended on the next generation, boys and girls must be kept in school. The role of women in World War I has often been represented through statistics documenting the massive numbers of socks, scarves, and sweaters they knitted, the miles of bandages they rolled, and the numbers of sons they gave up willingly, or not so willingly. When Woodrow Wilson finally and reluctantly spoke in favor of national women's suffrage in 1918, he argued that women's wartime service and sacrifice had earned them the right to vote, conveniently ignoring 70 years of women's political organizing to achieve that basic measure of equality in a democratic republic. But during World War I, there was another voice, a woman's voice that spoke from the floor of Congress. It was the voice of a woman who had helped to get suffrage passed in several states before the war, a voice that spoke to the connections between domesticity and politics. I will end as I began, with Jeannette Rankin. Although Rankin argued that dealing with food was natural for women, she also argued that women's relationship with food was political and global. Women as housewives, she said, should consider the food problem in the carload lot, and in the market, and in transit, and in storage, and in the Board of Trade, and in the national market, as well as in the small portion used on the family table. We know that we have, with our unparalleled resources and with our improved methods of production, a condition where there is no need for anyone to go hungry. And women must take an intelligent and responsible share in the world's work if all of the people are to be fed all of the time. Thank you. Minutes for questions before we can adjourn to the lay lounge. But if anyone has a question or a comment, that would be great. Oh, Jeff.
Was any of the propaganda extended into the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919 or the Depression of 1920 to 21?
I have only looked at the food, I've only looked carefully at the food material, and I haven't seen any of that. The Food Administration wraps up very, very quickly after the armistice, much to Hoover's dismay. He thinks that Americans should be, much more interested in European reconstruction. So I haven't seen any of that. It's a good question, though. Yeah. Yeah, Karen.
World War II was that whole idea of voluntarily curtailing your use of food and
over.
Because there was rationing, right?
Yes, right. Yeah. In fact, what were called war gardens in World War I become victory gardens in World War II, and food rationing is instituted very quickly. And food. I'm of course focusing on food because that's my most recent research. But fuel, there were similar efforts for fuel, and all of that is now officially rationed. It's not so much. It's not voluntary anymore.
Yeah. Is it that we didn't trust people to do it, or the population had just grown?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. There might be, Pierce might know, or other historians who usually go past 1940, which is where I usually stop. But yeah.
I think I remember signs about food not increasing prices, like stores would have a sign during World War II that they complied with some kind of
Right.
price restrictions.
Yeah, there was an Office of Price something or other, OP. Yeah, right, right. Yeah, I mean, there was terrible inflation, and there was, many complaints about what people had given up and to what benefit. There was such disillusionment after World War I as well. And I think that people just didn't trust that kind of voluntary system was going to work, and especially because, in between is the Depression, where Hoover's whole philosophy of voluntarism is, overwhelmed by the magnitude of that. So that I think that, you have the New Deal and all of those new government agencies kind of setting a precedent for regulation, which wasn't there in World War I. Yeah. Yes?
I'm curious, sort of, if you think there's any overlap with the rhetoric and the imagery that is employed with sort of the militarization of gardening and the opening of the front in the kitchen, and what seems sort of a cultural propensity in the States to have wars on poverty, wars on terror, wars on the family.
Right.
And if that's something that maybe existed prior to this, or if this actually really contributed in establishing the discourse.
It's a fascinating idea. Much of the same rhetoric that took place in World War I in the States also was used in Canada in World War I, and I'm sort of looking at that in this larger project. But are we predisposed to militarize ourselves? It's a good question. Yeah, I'm not sure. It's a good idea. Read.
What was it about wheat, either materially or culturally, that was so important in contrast to other grains and staples?
Yeah.
Why that?
Right. Well, wheat was considered to be the sort of premier grain, right? To be able to eat wheat bread versus rye bread had been a mark of status. All of the countries that shipped grain to Europe were heavy wheat producers. So the idea being, if you were going to give, and I shouldn't say give, because the United States did not give its wheat to the Allies. It sold it, and they made a lot of money during the war. But if you were going to support the war, there really was this kind of sense that you would support it with your best grain, and the best grain was wheat. It was kind of at the top of the grain pyramid, because peasants ate rye breads, right? Immigrants ate dark bread. Civilized people ate white bread, and so you would use wheat for that. Yeah.
Thanks for a terrific presentation, Mary. Not many people here know where Collins is. It's a testament to your research. It's between Dutton and Brady on the old road.
I'm sorry, Pierce, but they don't know where Dutton and Brady is either.
But I did meet Mrs. Mclain.
Oh my gosh!
Mrs. Mack, and she was something else.
Wow.
A suffragette for that tough old lady by that time.
Well, and she was a midwife, as I understand it. In fact, Jennifer transcribed her diary as part of this project. So, yeah, it's a great resource. Okay. Why don't we adjourn to the lounge and have some food and celebration?